Well, what a weekend it's been, but I think that quite possibly we've left the best till last even. And to chair this panel, he's a consultant cardiologist in the northwest of England, qualified in medicine at the University of Glasgow, and is now the founder of Venturi Cardiology. He's also the former president of the British Association for Cardiovascular Prevention and Rehabilitation. Please welcome on the stage, Dr. Scott Murray.
Thank you so much, Sam. And this is my second time being at PHC. I think I did the end of the peer show about 6 years ago when I talked about the heart of the future. And that's on YouTube if you want to see it. And we are seeing that in clinical practice now. There's an epidemic of HFpEF, which is when people are diabetic and overweight. So it's absolutely brilliant to be back and for everyone to be here for the final session. I'm sorry it's the graveyard shift, but we're going to be as quick as we can, get through it all. We're going to be polite and we're not going to argue too much about cholesterol, but hopefully these talks will give you a background as to where clinical lipidology sits, as well as consultant cardiologists and the other side of the fence and the unorthodox research and information that's coming through from David and his team, and hopefully we can balance it all up at the end and give you something to go home with. So I'd like to introduce the people who I'm lucky to share the stage with. We have Dr. Peter Lansberg. He's a famous Dutch lipidologist. He's an educator, he's an innovator, and he actually set up the Dutch National Lipid Clinic and created the Dutch Lipid Clinical Criteria for Familial Hyperlipidemia and the world-renowned Dutch National FH Screening Programme. He writes a statin newsletter, and so any questions about statins, please put them to Peter so that I don't have to answer those ones. Next to Peter, we've got a man who really doesn't need much introduction. We've got Dave Feldman, the OG from Las Vegas, we've known each other for about 8 years, Dave, is that right? He's a software engineer, but he set up the Citizen Science Foundation after finding that he could actually control his own lipids with his diet. And he could make his numbers go up or down, left or right, depending on what he wanted to eat that particular day. And now he knows more about lipids than Tom Dayspring probably knows. So we're grateful to share the stage with Dave. Next to David, we've got my colleague and friend, Mike Fisher. He's a professor of medicine and he's a consultant cardiologist in Liverpool, where we both work. We're both reformed interventional cardiologists. We used to share the cath lab together, putting stents in and then deciding whether we'd actually change the patient or not. And he qualified in 1988 for medicine in St Andrews and Manchester. He got his PhD in 2001 on the role of nitric oxide and vascular responses to that. And he's a professor in Liverpool and is part of the Institute for Cardiovascular Science and Medicine between Liverpool, Heart and Chest and Royal Brompton in the past. And at the end, we've got Professor Adrian Soto-Mota, who's an internal medicine physician with a physiology PhD from the University of Oxford. He originates from Mexico, if I'm not correct, Adrian, great. He's been a fellow at Harvard in data science, wow. So we look forward to hearing from everybody, and so we don't waste any more time, I'm going to invite Peter up to do the first talk, which is titled The Cholesterol Saga.
Yes, it's working. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Peter Lansberg from Holland. I've been working in lipids for the last 35 years, and I've seen all the developments in terms of diagnostics with genetics, and also in terms of therapeutics with some failures and some really good successes. I started my career when statins were actually introduced in 1989. And I followed the whole statin development over these last period. I've been invited to give sort of view why I think cholesterol is and will remain really important in the development of atherosclerosis. And what I'm planning to do is to give you some historical background, maybe that's new, and also, of course, my personal experience with FH patients and cholesterol and the impact on that. To start off, the lean mass hyperresponders logo, or the acronym, has been picked up internationally by a couple of people you might know. These are the lean and mean Holland racing machines. And they have political ambitions. They feel that all the rules and regulations about speed is rubbish. They say it's very easy to drive more than 300 kilometers per hour, and that is actually what we should do everywhere. There's no data that shows you that keeping the speed limit actually saves lives. No, we should go for more speed, it's more efficient. Anyway, that's what they try to promote. Now, of course, this is a little bit of a quink to what is sometimes proposed in the lean mass hyperresponders arena, that cholesterol is not relevant. And although I'm still very confused and also a little bit, tickled by the observations in the lean mass hyperresponders and cannot really explain it, I think there is a severe danger, and the severe danger is that what is present in lean mass hyperresponders is sort of proclaimed as something that should be embraced by everybody. Cholesterol is not relevant, cholesterol is not important, and it's not dangerous, and that is absolutely not true. Realize there is a complete community of lean mass hyperresponders of maybe a few hundred, even a few thousand, on a population of more than 300 million. So that is a distinct group, and that's why I thought this is a nice example where we have a distinct group of drivers that also think that speed is not something to worry about. This is a picture that was used when I was in medical school, and it shows you what happens when you get a myocardial infarction. This is called the Netter Atlas. And in the classical situation, it happens when you do exertion. So this guy comes up the stairs, it's cold, it's windy, he just had dinner in a restaurant. Actually, he had a cigarette that fell here on the floor. He's exerting himself, and then he grabs his chest, and that's when the myocardial infarction happens. And this is what actually is present in his coronary arteries. Here you can see a coronary artery, and there is all these plaques, there's thrombi formation, and although you can't see it quite well, but what is really observational here is that the color here is quite yellow. And there's not many organs in the body that have this really yellow opacity. And you can almost compare it with some foods that also contain something interesting, and that is yellow. You might think cheese, but I was thinking of, let's see if I can show it you. Yes, mayonnaise. This is actually mayonnaise, what you see. Because how do you make mayonnaise? Egg yolks and oil. So it's cholesterol and triglycerides, right? Pure cholesterol and triglycerides. And that is what is present, and that is sort of, it's staring into your eyes. And this was already known in the 1800s. This is a famous Russian military researcher, Anichkov, and he was the first to make that observation that cholesterol has an impact on atherosclerosis. And what he observed was it was predominantly present within this group of colleagues, the officers and the more wealthy people, and it was absolutely absent in the soldiers. You know, they died not of cardiovascular disease, but of poverty, hunger, and infectious disease. And he set out to prove this, and he was the first one to come up with an experiment where he would expose volunteers to a diet of cholesterol and triglycerides. These volunteers were actually rabbits. He used a rabbit model, and there is something that can be said about rabbits, but still, I think it's something very interesting to observe. So this is a clear aortic artery, no signs of atherosclerosis, and this is what you observe when there is atherosclerosis. And what he did, he fed these rabbits for 105 days, egg yolks and oil. Is that a ketogenic diet? I think so, right? Yeah. This is what happened. This is what happened. After 100 days of a ketogenic diet, and actually this is also 200 days again of a rabbit diet, which is carrots and salad, you can see all the distinctive feature of an extensive plaque. This is the necrotic core, these are the macrophages, there's calcic deposit. So severe atherosclerosis in a very, very rapid session. He also wanted to see if he could reverse it, and he could, by simply sticking to the diet. And the diet was, again, rabbit diet. And it took more than 2 years to get to this stage again. So it was something that very rapidly developed, and that took some time, but it was able to reverse. I make a jump now the 1950s. This was the Korean War. And in the Korean War, young men that died, it was compulsory to have a post-mortem examination to see the cause of death. Makes little sense, but that was sort of the rule. So they did that. And this is what they found. In 300 post-mortems, mean age 22.1 years, 77% had coronary atherosclerosis, and 39% had occlusive coronary artery disease. So that was something unheard of. People were shocked. How is that possible in these young, healthy guys? And what followed on that, or almost simultaneous, that they said, we want to know why, what causes this, because they didn't have an idea. So they started with what is called the Framingham Heart Study. Framingham is a small city, small village almost, near Boston in Massachusetts, and all the inhabitants, or no, not all the inhabitants, but a large number of the inhabitants, they were, this very confusing. 2,000 men, 2,500 women were followed over a long period. There's actually the Framingham offspring and the second Framingham offspring of the children and the children of these original cohort. And Framingham was actually the first to discover what caused it. And they came up with the term risk factor. And these were the most important risk factor that they found in Framingham that correlated with cardiovascular disease. And these risk factors still today remain the most important risk factors for cardiovascular disease. Now, there have been some studies to discover other cardiovascular risk factors, and this is an overview of more than a few hundred cardiovascular risk factors, some very, very obscure. But the basic line that we now follow in lipids is that we say, yeah, there are quite a few important risk factors, and tobacco, diabetes, hypertension, but the causal risk factor, the needed risk factor is actually cholesterol. If you have cholesterol, then these other factors play a role. If cholesterol is not present or is very low, even these other risk factors are unable to establish atherosclerosis. So LDL cholesterol is not only a risk factor, but it's a causative risk factor. One of the intriguing problems, I think, with cardiovascular risk management and the debates we have on cholesterol is the term normal. Everybody knows what is a normal blood pressure, and there's no discussion. Normal blood pressure is systolic. Worldwide, if you go to Asia, you go to Spain, or you go to South America, it's always 120 millimeters mercury. Why? Because if it's more than 120 millimeters, you get cardiovascular problems. If it's below, you don't need to worry. Similar for glucose. Level of 100 milligrams per deciliter, if it's higher, You get problems if it's below not. But with cholesterol, why do we say 200 is normal? Because again, that is the value that's usually embraced as the normal value. Is that the value, if it's below that, you don't get heart disease and atherosclerosis, and only above that? No. Most people have atherosclerosis with values below 200. The reason why they chose normal is they did a population screening, and they measured everybody, and the 50th percentile was 200. And they said, okay, that is the normal distribution. But I tend to differ. I think this is not normal. Normal, we should use the same definition as blood pressure and glucose, and that means we should look at levels where cholesterol is not able to promote atherosclerosis. So one way to look at physiological LDL cholesterol, I try to show you with this graph. These are three mammals. I have to look. These are humans, these are pigs, and these are sheep. And these are three phases: fetal, suckling, and adulthood. And these are the levels of plasma total cholesterol. And what is maybe a little bit too difficult to see, but in the pre-birth phase, in the intrauterine phase, all these mammals have a total cholesterol between 50 and 70. Then after birth, it goes sharply upwards. And the reason is you change your diet. You now get breastfed. Breast milk has lots of protein, fat, sugar. And in all animals, it goes up. When Mama Pig is fed up with breastfeeding, she kicks out the child pigs and said, okay, find your own food. And what do the child pigs do? They eat what pigs eat. And what happens with the cholesterol level? It goes perfectly back to the level of 50 to 70. But what happens with human children after breastfeeding? Bottle feeding, cow's milk. After cow's milk, Happy Meals. After Happy Meals, standard Western diet. So their cholesterol doesn't go down again, but it goes up and it stays high. If they did the same experiment in these other mammals, yes, also their cholesterol went up. And it's not uncommon for veterinarians taking care of small pets, dogs and cats, to use statins in these animals to reduce their risk for cardiovascular disease.
2 minutes, Peter.
Okay.
You've got 2 minutes.
So, physiological cholesterol, and to illustrate why that is really relevant, this is I go crazy with this clicker. This is a young boy, 3 years old. He has a fatty streak. Now, you might think this is a boy with familial hypercholesterolemia. No, it's not. It's a boy that was killed in an accident. They did a postmortem examination. At 3 years old, they found already atherosclerosis. Is that unusual? No, it's not. This is data from the Bogalusa heart study, where they discovered that 50% of the 2 to 15 years old of children that died from different causes, not cardiovascular disease, had fatty streaks, and actually 1 in 12 had established lesions. So it shows you that the impact of a not normal level really starts early. This is looking at the PESA study. This study looking at patients free of atherosclerosis, and these are three vascular beds, 1 vascular bed, and disease-free. The only ones that didn't have atherosclerosis is any of the vascular beds were the ones with an LDL cholesterol below 70. I'll skip this one. And I just want to show you my FH case. This is a patient that I saw early in my career. She was referred because her father had familial hypercholesterolemia, and her mother had hypercholesterolemia, and she had also the same high cholesterol level, and her mother was treated in those days with bile acid sequestrant. She never wanted to be treated in her young age because she was thinking about children, and we didn't know too much about pregnancy and lowering cholesterol. So at age 9, she's diagnosed. At age 25, she has her first myocardial infarction. And this woman is the example of good health. She's a fitness aerobics instructress, She's not a keto diet fan, but she is a vegetarian, hardcore vegetarian. She does everything that you can think of to become healthy and to stay healthy. Nevertheless, at age 25, she had a MI and a PTCA. So this is the risk profile, no other risk factors, except that she had a very high cholesterol. These are physical characteristics, normal blood indices, otherwise everything was normal. The only thing that was abnormal was her cholesterol level. And I just want to point out, this is with no medication, LDL of 300, high HDL, low triglycerides. And what happened with Miss K, oh, this is her family tree, so her father died at 59. No, her grandfather died at 59. Oh. Grandfather died at 59. Her mother at 67 is still alive with a very high LDL cholesterol but treated, and she at 32 already had her first event. Now, I saw her a few times. Her mother was my patient, and she absolutely didn't want to take medication. So she said, no, I'm going to do it with lifestyle, with supplements, with healthy behavior. So she had a second MI at age 32, and she had a last fatal MI at age 36. Now, that is really a waste of life where we could have done so much. Her mother is in her 70s, treated with a statin, treated with ezetimibe, and has a healthy, happy life.
Going to have to wrap up, Peter. Sorry, we're going to have to stop
okay.
and move on. Thank you so much.
I just want to show this one.
Yeah, sure. I see. Thank you so much,
yes?
Peter.
Okay.
Yeah, can you pass the mic to Adrian? Next up is Adrian Soto-Mota.
Thank you. While slides are on, I just would like to say thank you for the historical perspective. Actually, the first time I heard how important historical perspectives are on the history of ideas was from Gary Taubes. There's real value in knowing how ideas came up. And, I just want to apologize because I will say some things from a scientist point of view, I will say some things from a clinician's point of view, and I'll try to be very clear about the difference, but ask me or sorry if I don't do that. I will talk a lot before mentioning even cholesterol, because there are 2 points I want to make. And let me quote two of my heroes. One of the most influential teachers in my PhD, Alan Garfinkel, said, causal effects are the true purpose of science. If you want predictions, go to the astrologer. And the problem is that causal inference is really hard. And the second quote from one of my heroes, Richard McElrath, who wrote the best stats books I know, says, if we are very, very careful and we try really, really hard, we might not end up completely deluding ourselves. Causal inference, trust me, is really hard. So, because this is a causal question about a clinical disease, I just wanted to establish, don't ask too much from us. Causal inference is really hard. Now, the other point, and this is a short story before I start. Absolutely true. 4 years ago, I was there, Gandalf. I was there 4 years ago. I was a frontline COVID hospitalist. For the very first time in my life, all my patients had the same disease. I hope it's the last time of my life all my patients have the same disease. And we were overloaded. We had 3 times as much patients per doctor than we usually have. And one day, 2 of my patients not only had the same disease, had the same name and last name, and were one beside the other. And let me tell you, I was really, really afraid of me or anyone in my residence team or nurse team confusing them because one had a super high risk of bleeding and the other one had a super high risk of thrombosis. So I was genuinely anxious about it. The point I'm trying to make is you can have the extreme scenario where everyone has the same disease, the same name, and have two very opposite clinical scenarios that will require opposite advice. So if there is one thing I absolutely won't yield is nuance. I don't have conflicts of interest. I'm a boring guy. The only thing on my social media is a free stats course for Mexican doctors. And yeah, that's it. Now, causality has different shapes. And I mentioned this, this difference between sufficient cause and, if you want, contributing cause or a necessary cause. And all of you know this. But I will say that it is actually hard to say what caused someone's death. And let me go back to COVID. I mean, this is Lancet paper analyzing excessive mortality in Mexico. And we have this genuine question on, would this person have died if they didn't were so metabolically ill? On one hand, they did die of COVID. I mean, this is what precipitated their death. But on the other hand, you can totally see a case on why they were especially prone or especially susceptible to this bad outcome. And, to talk about what I mean, let's go for another controversial thing, gun control. Sometimes the point I'm trying to make here is that interactions matter more than the causal players. And this actually term that was invented in Framingham, risk factor, is very frequently conflated with causal player, causal element. It's used sometimes interchangeably. You could say guns kill people. And sure, but your gun could be empty. And yeah, maybe someone killed someone with the frame of the gun. But most times, when guns kill people, there's a bullet involved. So you say, okay, maybe bullets kill people. Well, but bullets are harmless if they're in a box. So then you say, well, no, okay, I get it. Armed people with killing intentions kill people. But they could have bad aim. And I guess what I am trying to say is that very frequently, what we mean by cause in normal language is the interaction of two causal players that it's actually what's triggering the event we're trying to study. So both things can be true at the same time. Now, causal inference is challenging, really challenging, especially, and I just don't have time for this. If you give me time, I can speak about this for a semester. But please do learn about causal diagrams and directed acyclic graphs. This is a good place to start. It's an incredibly powerful tool. And if it were my decision, I wouldn't let anyone receive their medical degree without knowing this. Some concepts that are important are confounders, colliders, mediators. I won't go into them. What I want to tell you is that there are multiple forms of confounders and of conditionings, of conditional and mediation, but that very frequently the studies we have assume that causal relationships the causal network is the term, or the causal structure, is panel A. So we are trying to analyze cause 1, cause 2, cause 3 with mediation 1, mediation 2, confounder or unobserved variable set with outcome Y. But in reality, causal networks, oh, you can't see that, sorry. Causal networks are a link. All of them are intertwined. And this really complicates things because we cannot adjust for multiple things at the same time, sorry, if they are interlinked, if the causal associations are interlinked. And these are the big 5 for the most common cause of death in the world. In no way I'm trying to throw shade into this paper. This is a fantastic paper. But I just wanted to mention that what they are doing is trying to see what's the attributable death toll that can be adjudicated to these big five, you all know. And if you see, these curves are curves. They're not straight lines. And they're not straight lines because these effects interact with each other. So it's very hard to know the isolated causal effect of something. And to give you an example, this is a DAG. What you see in green is the association, or the causal association we know there is between non-HDL and death, blood pressure and death, etc., etc. Each one of these arrows, each one of these directions has at least 10 papers. And what I want you to show you is that this study, it was beyond their scope, but this study is not using or not considering that income affects all of these, sedentarism affects all of these, well, some of them, and that they affect each other. So they are very hard to dissect. They are very hard to tell apart. Causal inference is hard. Of course, you can say that some things are independent. This is a mathematical symbol for independence, and there's no reason why we believe age should be strongly linked with your BMI or with smoking, whatever. But what I wanted to show you is that, I'll just remove it so you can read it. Biasing paths are open, and there is no adjustment set possible. Sometimes we just cannot know. We just cannot tell apart risk factors. So I know this is frustrating. It's frustrating for me as well. Be patient with us. Very frequently, we just can't give straight answers. Now, these effects are interacting, meaning when one changes value, the other one will change value as well. We know, for example, and this is a whole other debate, that, for example, the lowest mortality point for BMI shifts with age. There is an interaction between age and BMI. It's not always the same response. So this got very much more complicated, because now you need to take into account the interaction and the varying value of each of these. And let me say that these graphs are called acyclic because their golden rule is you just cannot go back to the origin. That's what makes them acyclic. And we know that some of these risk factors cause or enhance each other. So hyperinsulinemia will cause your LDL to go high. And inflammation will change your LDL. And inflammation, hyperinsulinemia you have this vicious cycle with impaired insulin action, for example. Hyperglycemia damaging your pancreas. Then you have impaired insulin secretion. Now you have chronic hyperglycemia. And, so this becomes a chicken and egg game where it's actually impossible to draw a causal inference graph. So it's really, really, really hard, even with the best tools we have today, for assess causal inference. Now, this is where I start talking about cholesterol. And what I want to say, nuance matters, context matters. I do have something to say about rabbits. They are strict herbivores. And plants do not have cholesterol. Plants have ergosterol. And if you feed a substance that an animal is not well equipped to metabolize, you shouldn't be surprised it clogs up everywhere. If you feed me kryptonite, I will surely die soon. So I mean, I'm not saying that model has no value. All I'll just say is context matters. It matters if you are an herbivore. The references are more important than the graphs, so that's where I will focus. We know that the same level of cholesterol has a different risk profile depending on context. So same level of cholesterol is not the same with CAC0 than without CAC0. And the same level of cholesterol is not the same risk profile with FH than without FH. So, in other words, we are not saying cholesterol doesn't matter. We're just saying context matters. So let's just be very clear about that. And we already know that from, this is a paper many of you will already know, same origin from the risk factor concept. We know that you can have same lipid triad profiles, more or less, cholesterol, triglycerides below 100, etc., and your risk will look different depending on one of those other variables. So I know I am saying there is no answer, but it's really, really hard. And I've been criticized on both sides of the aisle for contributing to the confusion or for spreading confusion or I like to say, or I like to reply, I am not adding confusion. I'm just removing the veil that makes people think reductionistically. Hopefully many of you know this diagram, so you'll forgive us for not showing well those labels. But what we're trying to say is that since the context in which your LDL goes up and the reason why your cholesterol goes up, we shouldn't expect to have the same risk profile regardless of very high LDL. If your lipoprotein lipase is working differently, you can expect opposite directions of many important regulators in lipid metabolism that will yield one scenario where you have lots of atherosclerosis and another scenario where, and let me be very clear about this, we don't know. We need to do research and we need to find out. But there is no reason to assume they are equivalent. That's what I am trying to say. Now,
two minutes.
Adrian. Yeah, I'm finishing. The point I'm trying to make is, oh gosh, I'm not responding. I'll skip this graph, so like Bing Binkman, ask me later. Let's imagine, random young man in their 20s with lots of knowledge about health, with lots of access to health, who knows that their coronaries are absolutely clean, who has his whole genome sequenced, and who has tons of data about their personal risk, who happens to have a very high LDL profile. Random person. Versus someone who is lean, had a heart attack, started a low-carb diet 2 weeks ago, and has a very high cholesterol. Their risk profile couldn't be more different. They're as different as the day and the night. Nothing predicts a heart attack as a previous one. Already having had a heart attack is your best predictor for a new one. So please do not think they are comparable. Both can meet the LMHR criteria, but their risk is very, very different. And therefore, please don't be surprised. Advice is different for them. Their risk is very different. Now, in other words, please do not drive at 300K in the Netherlands. Speed restrictions matter. Could save your life. And this has been written. We are not saying everyone should be on a statin. We're not saying no one should be on a statin. We know that's frustrating. Some people have criticized us for saying, take a stand. And the stand I will take is each one of my patients is different. I will assess the risk personally. I prescribe statins every day because I see patients who already have had more than one cardiovascular event. And those who have an extremely low risk profile, if they want, or for whatever reason they don't want to take a medication, there will always be someone who doesn't want to take a medication. Okay, with the best information you have, perhaps you can be very vigilant and decide otherwise. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Adrian. Great talk, Adrian. Great talk. Context matters. Yep. So Mike Fisher is now coming to the stage. I noticed the gloves are off for swearing now since Eddie's been. And me and Mike do have a habit of swearing quite a bit. So I actually got caught swearing at school when I was a kid, and the teacher said that it was a sign of a very low vocabulary. And I said, "I'm fucking sorry, miss."
Right, well, thank you very much indeed, and thank you for asking me to come and speak at this, which is something of a departure for me, because I'm used to speaking at rather dry academic medical conferences. So, we're asked to address the question, does cholesterol cause heart disease? And the answer that I think you'll have got from the previous talks is that it's complicated, okay? Well, it is complicated, but, you know, I'm an interventional cardiologist by trade. That means I'm basically a very simple soul, and I need to try and get simple answers, or simple-ish, as simple as it can be. So I want to try and let you know and talk about how do we actually think that we know anything in medicine. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to quote some data. Just in deference to Scott, and to quote Eddie, I know data can be fucking boring. But the fact is that data is how we know things, at least some of the time. So, does cholesterol cause heart disease? Does this flicker cause things to move on? There we go. So just a quick word about why do we have it anyway. We need cholesterol. It does all sorts of useful things in the body, and without cholesterol, we actually wouldn't exist. I'm not going to go through all of these, but you can read the slide. The structure of the cholesterol is what you see shown in the molecule there. But we absolutely need cholesterol. But the question here is not so much do we need it, because the answer to that is obviously yes. But to some extent, how much of it do we need? And you saw some of this data before, so I won't labor it too much. But babies are born with mean serum cholesterols of about 1.8 millimoles. That's total cholesterol, mind you, not LDL cholesterol. Around 6 months, it rises to around 4 or 5, depending on whether they're bottle or breastfed. But if you look at, you'll have seen from the previous slides that that doesn't fall in humans. Well, it doesn't in Western humans because we're all raised on Happy Meals. But if you look at somebody that follows what might be regarded as a much more natural diet for a human, i.e. the Kalahari Bushmen, their total cholesterol as adults is around 3 millimole per litre, which would be regarded as abnormally low for a Westerner. And if you actually look at how much we actually have as Westerners, because Kalahari Bushmen, of course, don't get atherosclerosis, but if you look at a population like us who does, if you look at the observed and mean predicted cholesterol, you could look at these. Now, the red line is what was observed in a survey in 91 to 92, before statins were used, and before there was really any serious attempt to lower cholesterol by any means. The blue line is what was predicted. The green line is what was observed. We're seeing the effects of treatment there. But the point is, if you look at the actual numbers, which I've just realized come out really badly, those graphs peak at cholesterol, total cholesterols of between 6 and 7. So if we accept that probably the Kalahari Bushman represents what a human is evolved to have in terms of this necessary cholesterol, we have at least twice as much, So how do we actually know anything at all in medicine, or how do we think we know anything at all? And when it comes to epidemiology, when you're trying to draw those causal inferences between data and outcomes, which as has been said, is notoriously hard to do, particularly in complex biological systems with multiple interacting factors. The Bradford Hill are a set of criteria that were drawn up by an epidemiologist, and he proposed these 9 things that you can use to kind of guide our thinking. And I want to just go through a few of these and show you to what extent the cholesterol hypothesis actually matches up with these criteria. So in terms of strength of association and consistency, the first 2. Well, the first thing to say is that the question we were asked, does cholesterol cause heart disease? And actually, the answer to that, as it's asked, is no. Because, as we've already heard, context really matters. And LDL cholesterol is the form of cholesterol in the circulation that actually seems to cause problems in the arteries, or so we believe, at least for most people. Cholesterol is a complicated thing. I think people often think, even some of my colleagues often think, that when we measure cholesterol, we're measuring something like blood glucose, which is a single molecule, which you can absolutely measure with precision. Cholesterol isn't like that at all. Cholesterol circulates in mammals' bodies in complex with proteins, mixtures of other fats, other things that either promote or inhibit oxidation. And these are separated neatly into different categories on the blood work that you get back from the lab. But actually, even within those, there are multiple of differences between what's being quoted as the same thing on that list. So it's not surprising that there's a complexity here. But having said all that, if you look at populations, and this is drawn from over 1 million people in different population studies, they looked at the mean cholesterol of those populations, and they looked at the chances of them getting heart disease. And you can see that as the cholesterol gets higher, the risk of cardiovascular disease goes up in a pretty straight line. If, on the other hand, you look at HDL cholesterol, that doesn't appear to cause heart disease because the association is the other way around. And I'm picking my words carefully here. I'm saying association because association is not the same as causation, okay? I could show you a graph of the amount of ice cream sold in Blackpool and the number of suicides in Blackpool in the same period and show you a correlation that is at least as good as the association between LDL cholesterol and coronary heart disease. Do we conclude that ice cream causes suicide? Well, it may cause a lot of things, especially to, as people know in this audience, but no. At least in the short term, ice cream does not cause suicide. What you're seeing is the effect of what's known in the trade as a residual confounder. Because what we've got there is that the amount of ice cream sold is dependent on the number of people in Blackpool, which varies dramatically from time to time. And the number of suicides depends on the number of people in Blackpool, a residual confounder. But the fact is that whereas the graphs I've shown you don't actually prove that LDL cholesterol causes heart disease, what it does show is that context counts because different forms of cholesterol, depending on which proteins and so forth are associated with, vary in completely opposite ways with cardiovascular disease. So the next notion was specificity. This is a notion that if you want to say that something causes something, there shouldn't be other things that cause that disease. And actually, as we've seen, that's not the case with even LDL cholesterol. This is a study that looked at thousands and thousands of MIs in heart attacks in a Chinese population. And it linked every single person who had an MI with their kind of twin in terms of their age, sex, and so forth, who hadn't had an MI. And it asked the question, what is different between those pairs of people? And this is what they came up with. And you can see top of the list is abnormal lipids. So again, it seems that there is an increasing association, at least, between LDL cholesterol and cardiovascular disease. But all of those other things are important as well. Context counts. But that doesn't take away from the fact that number one on this list is LDL cholesterol. And as you saw from one of the previous speakers, what we've got here is a model where we believe that LDL cholesterol is necessary for the development of heart disease. In other words, it is causative. But there are other things that modulate that risk. So depending on the rest of your risk environment, the strength of the association in any given individual is going to change dramatically. But over a population, it's a very strong association. Temporality. Well, very difficult to show because all humans are exposed to cholesterol all of the time, to some extent at least. But what we can say is if you look at a population like South Sea Islanders, or indeed Kalahari Bushmen, who we mentioned earlier, if you look at those becoming urbanized, which is so-called coca colonization, then their diet changes dramatically, and there is certainly a dramatic change in their serum lipids with an increase in LDL cholesterol, which is followed within the next 5 to 10 years by a matching increase in cardiovascular disease. So there is, difficult to show, but there is a temporal association. And there should also be a biological gradient. This is the same thing I showed before. Threshold effects rarely happen in biology. There tends to be a dose response. And as you can see from the slide that I showed you earlier, which I'm simply reproducing here, the total cholesterol varies pretty much linearly by with the rate of cardiovascular disease. Okay, so this brings us to one of the most important parts, because up till now, what I've shown you is that there is a strong association between LDL cholesterol and heart disease. That does not mean, as we've shown from ice cream and suicide, that the one causes the other. And so what you need to have in order to take your decision about which way we're going to call this debate is two things. We need to have plausibility and coherence. We need to have a mechanism by which we believe that there is a plausible link between LDL and heart disease. And our first speaker has already shown you some of this. But what I want to show you out of this rather complicated slide is two things. Firstly, LDL cholesterol in this model, which has been developed over many, many years with many different experiments, is at the start of it all. And secondly, all of this stuff here in the middle is to do with inflammation, okay? So the LDL cholesterol has to be there, but so much of this slide is to do with inflammation, which tells you that inflammation is also really important in this. And that may explain some of the debate about whether the LDL causes cholesterol or not. The other thing that you've got to show is experiments. There's got to have evidence. If this really is the case that LDL cholesterol causes causes heart disease in humans, then lowering it should lower the incidence. And it does. This is a graph which plots the multiple different studies that have been in humans on reducing LDL cholesterol by various means. Now, most of these trials are statins, but not all. Some of them use different drugs, some of them use lifestyle interventions. But the fact is, the striking thing is that it really doesn't seem to matter all that much, that pretty much these things lie on a line. And the more you reduce LDL cholesterol, the more you reduce the rate of heart disease. So, does reducing LDL cholesterol prevent heart disease? Yes, it does. So I would want to tell you, what I'm trying to make you agree with me here is that there is evidence that LDL cholesterol is the major risk factor in the initiation of atherosclerosis, but that we need other factors in order to develop that process and actually end up with clinical events. Agreeing with that statement does not exclude the possibility that there are some individuals, and this would be the lean mass hyperresponders, who appear to be resistant to the effect of a high LDL for a variety of metabolic or biological reasons. But the fact that those people exist does not change that conclusion. To give you an analogy, if I were to take 100 people and ask them to cross the road with their eyes shut, quite a few of them would actually make it to the other side, okay? Now, if I were to ask you to shut your eyes and cross the road, would you therefore believe that because a lot of people made it to the other side, crossing the road with your eyes shut is a safe thing to do? Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to partake in that experiment, but I think the answer to that is no. So LDL cholesterol certainly causes heart disease. It's not the only factor, and it's not sufficient on its own, but it sure does cause it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Mike. That was excellent, and I do like the analogies. That helps. So, in interest of time, so we can get some questions and debate, next on the stage is Dave Feldman, and I think this is what you guys are here for, so feel free to whoop and clap and do your thing that you...
Okay. Stay near the lectern.
He's already changed his slides about 5 times, by the way.
I did. You know, what is it, necessity being the mother of invention? Actually, I had some epiphanies that helped me to figure this out, to better illustrate it to you. And I really appreciate, once again, joining these wonderful panelists. And I appreciate everyone being such good sports. I think good, considerable conversation and dialogue is what we need more of in this space. Thank you. These are my conflicts of interest, sort of. I don't know that they really apply, but I try to be overly transparent if I can. And I'm going to actually skip over this. You pretty much know who I am by this point. I want to talk about 3 groups, and I want you to memorize these 3 groups because you've heard me talk about dysfunctional lipid metabolism almost as kind of a pass-through statement. But how does this apply to the debate we're having today and really just in general, particularly when it comes to lean mass hyperresponders? Well, so here are the 3 groups. First one is going to be, and this is talked about a lot today, which is familial hypercholesterolemia, or FH. Second group, I'm calling insulin resistance syndrome. You may call it metabolic syndrome, et cetera. And then, of course, lean mass hyperresponders themselves. Now, I want to focus first on group 1, and this is arguably one of the most important discoveries in lipidology, which is called monogenetic FH. It's caused by mutations of a single gene, typically the LDL receptor, ApoB, PCSK9, and it leads to a significant elevation in low-density lipoprotein cholesterol levels and a higher risk of cardiovascular disease. Brown and Goldstein won a Nobel Prize for this 50 years ago. Very young children who were born with this disease, a homozygous FH level, and they would get cardiovascular disease very early with very high levels of LDL, which cemented in many people's minds that they indeed were that LDL does indeed cause atherosclerosis quite conclusively. But more recently, we're looking also at polygenetic FH, and this is influenced by a cumulative effect of multiple genetic variants, each contributing some effect to overall cholesterol levels, resulting in an increase in LDL-C and a varied risk of cardiovascular disease. And then there's this third group within FH, because FH is phenotypic. It's whether or not you have high LDL cholesterol overall, but this is of an unknown origin. Now, my colleague, Adrian Soto-Mota, already knows, he kind of spoiled this one for me. There already is a study on this from JAMA. So what do we see in studies that compare these 3 categories? There's probably, I want to say, a dozen that I've looked at thus far. And this is actually from his slide, but I'm going to zoom in a little bit more. The LDL plus, that's those who have no known genetic combination. Poly and mono are here. But if we zoom in a little bit closer, these are the first time 2 events, and you can actually see there really is a distribution that's different for the same levels of LDL cholesterol. I'll go ahead and skip past this part, but you can also see it for the hazard ratios as well. So same level of LDL cholesterol when compared, but yet you have different levels of cardiovascular disease risk. It's different between those, it's kind of faded out here, those who have no known level, slightly higher for those with polygenetic, and definitely for those who have monogenic, especially homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia of monogenetic origin, they do tend to have very high levels of LDL and often very early cardiovascular disease. But when they can actually break it out to do a comparison here between LDL that's of equal levels, you have different cardiovascular disease risk. Now I want to hit groups 2 and 3 at the same time. Those with insulin resistance syndrome and those who are lean mass hyperresponders. So this is conceptual, but basically what you tend to find is that there's a moderately higher level of cholesterol as you get up on the different metabolic syndrome cut points, right? So there's just a little bit that rises overall, and as we've shown in Adrian's paper, with people who go on a ketogenic diet, typically if you're going from, say, a BMI of 35 down to something like 25 especially, you tend to see a drop in LDL. But notice how LDL moderately go up as you actually increase, and that's why it was paradoxical to so many of us to find those going on a ketogenic diet who actually are leaner and more metabolically healthy. As they get leaner, their LDL cholesterol goes up. And as I'm showing conceptually, we're seeing LDL cholesterol we don't even typically see in folks who have insulin resistance syndrome. So understandably, there's this enormous urgency for us to find out what's going on. But this is where it gets a lot more interesting. You throw in the particle counts, LDLP and ApoB, and you see what we call discordance. So there actually is a high amount of particles relative to the amount of LDL cholesterol. But in lean mass hyperresponders, in fact, even as you get leaner, as long as they're typically metabolically healthy, it tends to be concordant. So they tend to have high particle count along with a high LDL-C in a fairly predictable manner, actually. But this is important. the color's washed out, so you can't actually see the difference, but this third bar here is the triglycerides. This is the strongest difference between these two groups and within the groups, is the triglycerides are through the roof typically with insulin resistance syndrome. They tend to have hypertriglyceridemia, and it tends to get worse and worse. Yet conversely, lean mass hyperresponders, I mean, it's defined by the phenotype, but frankly, it's just what typically comes with it. And conversely, HDL cholesterol tends to counterbalance against it. All right, so let's now delve into my super abbreviated version of the lipid energy model in lean mass hyperresponders. Sorry, tiny bit of biochemistry, just go with it. You ready? This is a lipoprotein. It's got a lipid core, it's got water-based outside, so it's soluble. And when it starts out, it's bloated with lots of lipids, but the ones we're interested in are triglycerides. If you're fueled by fat, I guarantee whatever your lipid levels are, you are trafficking a lot of triglycerides on board lipoproteins. And what we're especially interested in are very low density lipoproteins that come from the liver. So the lipid energy model centers on this high turnover of triglyceride-rich VLDL. And so here you can see the cell surface. This is so washed out. I hope this translates well. But we're going to zoom in just on one transaction, one VLDL and a cell surface, and the cell surface wants those triglycerides. So it's expressing this lipase called lipoprotein lipase. It says, I want this. And so it interacts with this VLDL, and what happens is that the triglyceride-rich VLDL turns into a triglyceride-poor LDL. And it's doing it by dropping off these triglycerides. It's coming off of the VLDL, right? Okay, another major component is a fleet of small, nascent HDL particles that are nearby. They start out small, unlike the VLDL, and they get big. How do they get big? Well, actually, it's this transaction. All of these components that are coming off of the surface of the VLDL, as it shrinks, the HDLs pick up and they get bigger. So this turnover process, it's basically making us these triglyceride-poor LDL, these large HDL. And this is what we think is going on with lean mass hyperresponders, is this cycle is going faster, right? Hopefully you followed me up to this part, because now we can explain the triad. If you've got more of these VLDL turning into LDL, then of course this would explain an increase in LDL cholesterol. Moreover, if you've got turnover of these ApoB picking up the components into HDL, that explains the higher HDL cholesterol, and intrinsic to this process is, of course, the lower triglycerides. It's a successful process. It's about the success. Think of it that way, success versus failure. All right, but let's go back to this. And now that this is in the middle of your head, what if this cell doesn't take up as much of the triglycerides? It's full. It doesn't need it. So this starts to slow down. What does that mean? That means the triglyceride changeover of the triglyceride-rich VLDL, it's slower to turn into triglyceride-poor LDL. That also means that the small HDL, they're getting slowed down into the conversion into the large HDL. Now, if that's true, and I'm highlighting this, what do we see more of? What would we expect to see more of? We would expect to see more triglycerides, right? If we were to take a snapshot in the bloodstream of somebody, would we expect to see more VLDL? We do, right? Would we expect to see more small HDL? We do. All of the things I just mentioned, they are associated more with atherosclerosis. And I'm telling you right now that often they are identified to be thought of as more atherogenic particles, that the particles themselves are the source of the atherogenicity. Now, I'm not the smartest engineer on the planet, but I'm going to go down a limb and say that it's possible that this is more a result of insulin resistance syndrome as well as the increase in atherosclerosis. Now, to what degree we can differentiate and disentangle it, as my good friend Adrian said, that's a hard question to answer. It's a hard question to answer. But I believe we have to have this on the table. We have to. Okay, so I think there's a traffic jam, and people have insulin resistance syndrome with their lipids, and that makes complete sense if they're well past their personal fat threshold. So with this in mind, And putting all of these together, what do I like to call this? I like to call these first two groups, group 1 and 2, I like to call them having dysfunctional lipid metabolism. They have some form of an impairment, some problem with the way that they handle their lipids. And while I don't have enough time to go into it in this talk, what I'm pointing to here, for example, are things like immune cells, particularly macrophages, because macrophages themselves having an inability to handle lipoproteins in the same way as my macrophages do or my panelist macrophages do, I think is extremely relevant because they are there in the atheroma. They are there at the scene of the crime. And there's some fantastic studies that I've had some great discussions online for. I believe in the case of insulin-resistant syndrome, you've got systemic dysfunctional lipid metabolism. So I love how Dr. Fisher brought up Bradford Hill because I'm a big fan of Bradford Hill. So strength and consistency we can start to really talk about if we can get away from populations that have dysfunctional lipid metabolism, because I'm sure my panelists will concede that's where almost all of our data that finds this association comes from, is it comes not only from these groups, but typically toward the right side of these groups. That's where the strongest amount of that LDL and its association with atherosclerosis comes from. We need to get this variable of interest all by itself. And that's where lean mass hyperresponders afford us an incredible scientific opportunity, because you have super high levels of LDL, super high levels of ApoB, with presumably, I don't know because it's a hypothesis, with presumably no dysfunctional lipid metabolism. Okay, how am I doing on time? Where am I at?
3 minutes.
3 minutes? Okay, so I have to zoom real quick to the data of the Keto CTA Miami Heart Study. And you pretty much know the setup, but just so you know, it was a match analysis with Miami Heart. Miami Heart is over here on the right side, Keto's on the left. I'm gonna have to zoom through this quickly, but basically the match data is fantastic. It's 80 versus 80. It's CT angiography in both of our groups. And it was incredibly matched. The one key difference is the body mass is slightly different between the two, but the lipids are importantly different. And I went ahead and converted it for you guys because I love you. You can see on the left is the keto group. Average LDL cholesterol is 7.03. This is with an average age of 55.5, so well into middle age. And the Miami Heart is 3.18 at like the same age. So both groups are metabolically healthy, but ours definitely has much higher atherosclerosis, or I'm sorry, has much higher levels of LDL. These are the actual graphs. I'm glad these didn't wash out. And importantly, what you can see is that the plaque levels are actually very comparable to each other. In fact, in the next graph I'll show you the overlap. We actually have less plaque in the LMHR group. But this blue line actually represents the LDL cholesterol itself. That's what the blue line is. And there is no association between the LDL cholesterol and the plaque in both of these metabolically healthy groups. You'll notice also let me actually just jump straight to the conclusions. This is how we get the total plaque score. This is like the overlap. This blue line here, this is ours, so you can actually see the area under the curve between the two. Now, I don't bring this up to say our group is doing better. It's still a statistically insignificant difference. And so I'm just saying that they're trending better, but we still need more data to find out. This is still early stages. But let me just read the conclusion real quick. After mean duration of 4.7 years, our group averages 4.7 years, nearly half a decade, at these levels of LDL cholesterol. And in spite of that, at 7.03, sorry, that should be millimoles, of lean mass hyperresponders and near lean mass hyperresponders, ketogenic diet did not have greater atherosclerotic burden than participants with population-based cohort with similar risk profiles but markedly lower LDL cholesterol. And don't miss this next part. There's no correlation between LDL cholesterol level and plaque burden. So, in short, if there's anything I want you to bear in mind, not just for this panel, but moving forward, when I'm talking about dysfunctional lipid metabolism and why I think lean mass hyperresponders have such a key and important significance, it's for this very reason. It's because it's the one time that I believe we may have finally been able to get that variable away, be able to disentangle it to better understand what the true level of risk is for its association. That's my talk. Thank you so much.
So before this talk, who thinks that there's good and bad cholesterol? Can you get a show of hands? It's hard to see, but there's good and bad cholesterol, so there's a smattering of hands. Well, no, it's just the same cholesterol, okay? So don't get caught up in the this is good, this is bad debate. It's the same cholesterol. It's in different lipoproteins that carry the cholesterol. So it's the lipoproteins that are important. So I'm going to start with some questions with as chair's exception or chair's ability, if that's okay with you guys. Peter, if I can just start on your talk and ask you a question. So from a clinical perspective, as a cardiologist, people come in all the time. They've been started on a statin from their general practitioner because they've put all their details in to a Q risk or a Framingham risk, and because of their age and their cholesterol levels, they've been put on a statin. And those people come in and they say, I can't take it. It hurts. You know, I don't want to take this drug. I read the Daily Mail and they said it's going to give me cancer or whatever. And what I wanted to ask you was, how do you get around that in your practice? And what about the patients who stay on the statin and their LDL is good, but their triglycerides are still high and they're still insulin resistant? You need to give the mic.
So I could talk for several hours on statin safety. I know there is a lot of critique about statins that has surfaced into almost a tsunami about the dangers of statins. Let me point out first a very important point. Safety of statins is undisputable. Undisputable. There is not a single drug on this planet that is safer than a statin. Let me explain.
Just let him finish, please.
Let me explain.
We're all
I'm not
friends
talking
here.
about tolerability, although there is some nuance there, but safety means, does it really harm a patient? What we know
Don't shout out, please.
what we know is that there are two serious complications with statins, and that's life-threatening complications. That's rhabdomyolysis and fatal rhabdomyolysis. How often does that happen? Rhabdomyolysis is probably 1 in 20 to 1 in 50,000 patients. Fatal rhabdomyolysis is roughly 1 in 250 to 500,000 patients. Now to compare, if we take aspirin, you only need to treat 250 patients for 1 year to have a serious gastrointestinal bleed. You need to treat 2,000 patients for 1 year to have a fatal gastrointestinal bleed. If a young woman takes oral anticonceptive, you need to treat 5,000 women to have a serious and sometimes fatal pulmonary embolism.
Yeah.
So as a comparator, I always say peanut butter is less safe than statins. More patients die from peanut butter allergy and anaphylaxis than from statin-associated serious complications. The other point is tolerability. Now, again, what is the most important frequent complaint? You told me,
yeah.
Muscle side effects. That is such a difficult symptom to evaluate. Who doesn't have sometimes muscle side effects? Everybody. But if you feel that it's related to this new drug, or you read something about this drug, you think, yes, this is definitely from the statin. We did some really intriguing research, and the problem is, if you want to study statin muscle side effects, you have to have patients with real statin muscle side effects. And if half or more of these patients have indeed muscle problems but not caused by statins, how can you evaluate if it's caused by the statins? There was a study called the NS1 study, which I really liked. And it's a study that consists of 3 phases. One phase is that you get a bottle and you don't know what it's in it. Is it placebo? Is it statin? By the way, these were patients who were really statin intolerant. They had tried already many different statins and were referred back to this trial. Another bottle, again, had placebo or the real drug. and another bottle was empty. So you used 4 months, one of each of these procedures. And now the patients had to mark from 0 to 100 their muscle symptoms. Now what happened is that when patients were using the real or the placebo, there was almost the same amount of muscle complaints. Only when they were not using anything, there were definitely less muscle complaints. On a grade from 1 to 100, the average score was 15. So that doesn't mean that you're paralyzed in bed. No, that means you get up and you think, oh my God, yeah, I have a little cramp here, or my knee is a little stiff. Realize there is no drug that has no side effects. Nothing in life is without side effects.
Can I ask you on that? Do kids get side effects from statins? Because you treat some children with statins, is that correct?
Not personally, but a pediatric cardiologist, a colleague of mine, they sometimes also get side effects, but a lot less than children. And to be honest, I started with statins in the 1980s and 1990s when we were using cholestyramine. I had patients dancing on the table because they didn't have to take these horrible drugs anymore. They said, now this is a single pill. I feel fantastic and my cholesterol goes down dramatically.
Okay, thanks very much, Peter. And there'll be questions from the audience later. We'll get through. So I'm not gonna go to you next, Dave. I'm gonna keep you for later. I'm just gonna ask Adrian if you could come in, please. And I know Dave has touched on it, and you've been involved in the papers, but you've got the PhD in physiology. So I'm gonna ask you. Can you explain simply about what LPL, lipoprotein lipase, mediated VLDL turnover is and how that improves lipid metabolism? From the point of view as well that when you eat saturated fat, you might downregulate your LDL receptor. Does that, I know that's a very complicated question, but I think we need to get into the really nerdy stuff here or I'm going to be disappointed.
Sure. Never trust anyone for their credentials, definitely. Never trust anyone who responds for their credentials. What I would say is that lipoprotein lipase is one of the crucial steps in metabolizing lipids. That's for sure. That's not debated. We know this enzyme works better or has a faster, more efficient activity if you are exercising and if you eat fat. And from an evolutionary point of view, that makes sense, right? If you are consuming fat, your body will upregulate one of the crucial starting process of what you are consuming, if that's what you have around. This lipoprotein lipase difference in activity, well, to go to the other part of the spectrum, lipoprotein lipase will downregulate or will work less efficiently if you have insulin resistance and if you are not moving much. And for many, many years, it has been believed that what influences strongly the amount of LDL circulating in your blood is how much saturated fat you consume. And let me be very clear, this is true in most humans, because most humans have insulin resistance. Yeah. And 85% of the world has at least one marker of insulin resistance. So this is true. Saturated fat intake will cause LDL going up in most people. Now, the best possible reference I can think of for a counterpoint is Jeff Bolek's paper, 2019 in JCL, where changing diet composition progressively, that's a key word, he showed that the amount of saturated fat you intake is not associated with LDL, circulating LDL when carbs are not around. So if you have high saturated fat but not carbs, then that association is lost. And the way I interpret this data or these results is that, to me, it makes sense that, let me put some context there. This idea of high sugar, high saturated fat is new in the world. It's something that is our characteristic, is a hallmark of ultra-processed food. And it makes sense that in the context when we ate saturated fat, there wasn't much sugar around. So in a biochemical point of view, it's somewhat of something nonsensical to have both at the same time. So you are especially efficient in metabolizing saturated fat when you're only eating saturated fat. You will not be as efficient if carbs are around saturated fat, because your metabolism is like not knowing what to do, which macronutrient to prioritize. And there's tons of biochem there, and don't take my word, go and read Volek's lab paper, JCL 2019.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, so Mike, I want to turn to you next for the question, because we work in Liverpool, as you know. I will say it again, salad dodgers are there. This is what I was picked up on in the last conference I did. People reminded me that I said the word salad dodgers. If Eddie was here, he'd probably put an F in front of that. We see people, and they're not lean mass hyper responders at all. Okay, you know, they're very much, you know, couch responders, I'd probably say, and I'd probably say fast food, couch-based fast food responders. Yeah, and if someone like that is going to make a transition in their diet and try and change it for the better, we can see people who do that and their numbers come down. What would you say that you try to achieve in your lipid optimization clinic for the people who have had events? Because let's make this distinction. We've got apples and pears, you know, people who run and are fit and are getting studied by Dave, the ice baths and ribeye steaks and whatever. They're not going to get heart disease because they're health conscious realists, and we don't see those people in clinical practice. So how are you going to treat those patients, Mike, who come in and say, oh, I'm eating a lot more fat now, doctor, because I've read that that's really good for my heart?
Right, great question. Yeah, well, as I say, I don't see a lot of lean mass hyper-responders in my clinical practice, but I think the first thing to say is I do see the odd one, and what I actually say to those people is that firstly, my job is to give them advice, not tell them what to do. But secondly, that we have a number of tools now in cardiology. We're quite lucky that we can actually see the outcome of a dysfunctional metabolism in the coronary arteries using CT scans before they declare themselves actually having a heart attack, which of course in about a third of cases, they never even make it to hospital because they die in the field. So if I get somebody with that sort of pattern, what I will do is I will scan their coronary arteries. If their coronary arteries show no sign whatsoever of the adverse outcome, in other words, they do not have any atheroma, I will tell them that it's reasonable to conclude on the basis of the evidence that we have right now that they fall into this category of functional lipid metabolism. And I tell them that, you know, despite what the guidelines say, if I were you, I would not take a statin, okay? And Eddie said earlier on that we're bound by the guidelines, the doctors can't help themselves. Well, that's bullshit, actually. Guidelines are really important, and in the main we would be better doctors if more people followed the guidelines, but they are just that. They're guidelines, not rules. And I've spent a lot of my professional life in some areas practicing beyond the guidelines, and I've not been sued yet, and hey, I'm 60 now anyway. By the time they struck me off, I'd be retired, so I don't care anymore, you know. Okay. So, but coming to the people that Scott mentioned, I think these are a different people because they've declared themselves that they are susceptible to the effects of a dysfunctional lipid metabolism. They have had a heart attack. So again, my advice to them would be that I personally believe that the evidence is that it actually doesn't matter how you get your cholesterol down, but that the number of people who fall into the category of having had a vascular event, who can really get their cholesterol down to the sorts of levels that we know are associated with really low risks of having another event, are really small, let's be honest here. You know, that group of people is a smallish minority. And so I would still tell those people, by all means, eat more fat, But look, we want to do something to lower your risk right now. And to be frank with you, the best evidence that we have right now is that you lower the body count most effectively by taking a statin. That's
Right.
the evidence we have.
I'm going to stop you there. Adrian, would you give that patient a statin who's got coronary disease and a high lipid? I'm going to put you on the spot.
Absolutely. I mean,
Right.
yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Peter, I'm going to turn it the other way. Could you pass the mic to Peter, please? Peter, if a patient has normal coronary arteries, okay, they're 50 years old, they've had a CTA, there's no calcium, there's no plaque there, they've had high lipids their entire life, are you putting them on a statin?
Do they have other risk factors?
No.
No hypertension, no
No, they
glycemia?
got to 55. All they've got is a very high ApoB. Are you going to treat it?
No, I'll explain to them what the situation is, and that his or her coronary arteries are spick and span and clean, so there is no real indication to be worried on the short term and perhaps even on the long term. I leave it also to the decision of the patient himself. Sometimes patients are really motivated. They are very knowledgeable about atherosclerosis, about cholesterol lowering, and they see it as an addition, almost like, people that take vitamins or collagen or something like that. And to be honest, I feel that statins are in that category.
Okay.
But it's, I always say what is really relevant is you follow the guidelines in terms of your own clinical experience and knowledge and interpret that depending on the situation. Sometimes you go beyond the guidelines because a patient in your perception is very high risk, or sometimes you take a step back and discuss it and feel open to the patient to make that choice.
Would you scan their neck, ultrasound the neck to look for
with
carotid plaque?
clean coronary arteries?
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
No.
Okay, great, Peter. Could you pass the mic to David, please? How long have we got, Sam, before we go to questions? Well, can I make my train then and wrap this up now? I'm joking. Right, David, I've got a question for you, and then we'll ask questions back and forward, because I think you guys need to ask each other some questions and just not me asking questions. So, Dave, I've got a difficult one for you. So we are comparing apples with oranges, and you've got some health-conscious realists who look after their health. Can I ask you about the LDL story for you, okay? LDLs have two origins, don't they? They have the 60% from the lipolysis of VLDL, which you showed on your graph, and there's 40% that are directly secreted from the liver. And the fact that in the body, the triglyceride status of the body is important, isn't it? Your cholesterol pool, your triglyceride. Talk to me about the regulation of this, because the percentage of LDL that's directly secreted by the liver decreases as the triglyceride goes up. So how does that work in the lean mass hyperresponder? Is all the LDL coming from the VLDL, or is there an element where the LDL is being directly secreted from the liver?
So I think you're leaning on, for example, work such as Sachs that speak to, let me see if I can summarize it, that the liver is secreting ApoB 100, which is a type of ApoB, and it's not just VLDL, it can also secrete direct triglyceride poor LDL.
Yeah.
The catch is, and the only reason I have some knowledge on this is because we've investigated doing tracer studies for some time. Tracer studies do rely some degree on multi-compartmental calculations. And because of that, with love in my heart, because this is a challenge, it's a challenge period, you have to rely a lot on those underlying assumptions. So part of what my answer to this would be is, I believe if you were to microscopically be able to watch the secretion of ApoB 100 lipoproteins leaving the liver, there would be a large variability of triglyceride load. It'd be very heterogeneous, period. But I honestly don't really care that much. It's whether or not there's greater secretion of triglycerides, period, on board ApoB 100 lipoproteins in mass, whether there's a lot of, large ones or even more medium-sized ones. The turnover in the periphery is what's more relevant to me.
Okay.
If where you're going is, could the direct secretion of LDL particles independently associate with atherosclerosis?
Yeah.
So let's say it's 40% for one person, it's 30% for another person. It's an interesting question. I just don't know that I could rely a lot on those calculations being correct in the first place to ascertain that.
I was just thinking about, obviously, the people with the big body mass that you've got there, who are cholesterol, like, maxed out, triglyceride maxed out. There's no room at the fat cell motel. The non-esterified fatty acids come back into the bloodstream. Fatty liver, fatty heart, it's all going on. They're the ones that we should be worried about. I think that we could all potentially spot those people in clinical practice. But what about the lean mass hyperresponders who do have some familial cholesterol problem, an actual, like you said,
like a genetic,
or they've got an ApoC3 problem that's making things stick around a bit more. How do we tease that out? Are we going to ask everyone who's a lean mass hyperresponder to get their ApoC3 done?
Yes.
Are we going to scan all the coronaries? Are we going to do?
I want all the data.
ApoB, on absolutely everyone. LP(a). How do we get through this?
Scott, can I get on my soapbox for a moment?
Yeah, I think we've got time, have we?
Can we just start doing more research on healthy populations, period? Can we do that? That would be great, because if we did, we would know a lot of this already. ApoC3, I was chatting about this with Peter Attia 6 years ago. ApoC3, just like the lipid cargo, also moves. The only non-exchangeable apolipoprotein is ApoB. ApoC3, ApoC2, they all move, and they move dynamically, and they move based on flux and a lot of what the crosstalk is between tissues. It is, I'm sure Peter knows this better than I do, it's very difficult to try to take snapshots of what the blood work looks like and figure out what happened before. The reason I like having this up here is because what I can expect of the far right end of the purple group is that the same size LDL particle, and I'll bet you would agree with me on this, of that group is going to have a different triglyceride to cholesterol ester ratio. They're going to have more triglycerides and less cholesterol esters. And I'll bet you my car that on the right side of the lean mass hyperresponder group, it's going to be the exact reverse. They're going to have a small amount of triglycerides and a large amount of cholesterol esters for the same size LDL particle. Why? Because the LDL particle is a manifest of what happened before it. So how it was treated, what its cycle was from the moment it left the liver as something different, as a VLDL, full of triglycerides. And what that tells us is that there was more cholesterol ester transfer protein activity and less lipoprotein lipase activity. Now, we don't get to look at those things on a panel. So we need to get studies of healthy people on all diets. And if we did, we would get so much more knowledge. And one of the things that's heartbreaking for me as an engineer is I feel like we keep looking at graveyards of cars and the cars that are broken down, and we're doing the studies on that and then trying to extrapolate that to what should be a working car. Rather, we should be looking at the working cars, right?
Okay.
So I think we can't answer these questions very well when we're starting with looking only at ApoC3 in populations that have already high atherosclerotic cardiovascular risk due to other risk factors because they already have dysfunctional lipid metabolism.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Can you pass the mic to Peter? Yeah, please. Peter, can you, as a lipidologist, can you balance this up for us, because I'm trying to work out in my head how we can all win from this debate and how we can all go away and put something into our daily life. Because if you eat too much fat, your LDL goes up. Yeah, in most people. If you eat too much carbs, your glycemia goes up. And I think there is this weighted scale balance at the level of the liver, where if you're carbohydrate deplete, you go pushing up your lipids. If you're actually lipid deplete, you're pushing up your carbs, and we see that with statins, don't we? We push the LDL down, we kind of push people a bit more and resistant, their glycemia goes off. So how do we win here? How do we get some balance back here? Is it the sterol regulated element binding protein versus carbohydrate regulated binding protein liver? Do we eat a balanced diet? Is that how it works?
Well, I think first and foremost, listening to the stories and seeing the presentations, I think you as practicing clinicians realize that what we see on a daily basis are not patients with lean mass hyperresponders. You know, you are the Formula One drivers, and you're not the drivers that are driving around here. From a practical point of view, doing a strict diet, if it's ketogenic or carnivorous or Ornish diet, every diet has its challenges. And I see very, very few people, few exceptions, that really maintain a diet for a really long time, a lifelong time. So you have these fluctuations where you have maybe benefits on one side or harms on the other side. There is social factors that involved. In my experience in education, I do a lot of tours in developing economies. Completely different story. It's almost impossible to think about improving lifestyle, and you have to really address issues early. These people have myocardial infarctions in Pakistan, where I just came, in their 30s. In our countries, in their 50s. So we have to really address the risk factors that we can obviously see and manage with very simple strategies that are safe and efficacious. And then aiming to put them on a ketogenic diet is not going to work. For myself, I'm a firm believer in the Mediterranean lifestyle. I think that's a well-balanced diet that has shown very proven benefits in terms of cardiovascular risk reduction without the extremes, in combination with proper control of risk factors, which are blood pressure, glycemic control, and cholesterol, with the simple, affordable, and effective and safe drugs that we have. I think that is a realistic strategy. Now, what you guys are doing is very interesting scientifically, because it is still, for me, a puzzle how you're able to manipulate these cholesterol levels in such a fast way. But the only problem I have, and that's genuine, is that once people hear, oh, you know, cholesterol is not a problem, it's actually good because it's a sign of good metabolic health, they don't know the nuances. They just hear what they want to hear, and they throw away the statin.
Yeah. Okay.
That is for me a big issue. Yeah.
Okay. If you could.
Can I add to that real quick? So it's just, I do try to take more opportunities than I did in the beginning to re-emphasize. Part of the reason I try not to even talk about statins or cholesterol-lowering medication is that, quite literally, I want to leave it to the physicians. And it's why I try to stay, literally in almost every podcast now, I try to say I want people to work with their doctor, to work with their family, to learn everything that they can. And that what I'm doing is I'm trying to work on the horse, and the cart is the medication on what you do about the horse. So by no means do I want people to have the impression that our research, it can certainly be the case that our research may show that the group we're looking at, which intentionally has folks who do not at baseline have cardiovascular risk factors, it applies to that group that we're studying. So does that apply to other people outside of that? We don't know. Do I want people to assume that? I don't want anyone to assume anything that we're not ourselves stating. So I like to take the opportunity to further level reset for the same reasons you described. I don't want anyone to turn this into a false dichotomy.
Great. I mean, just for everyone who's in the audience, I mean, I think a lot of people come to the clinic that I'm at and they say, well, my HDL is great. Am I not invincible? And I think we haven't really touched on the HDL story, but I think we're safe to say, does everyone in the panel agree that whilst HDL might give an idea as a sort of platform or a barometer to where you are with your metabolic health, the level of HDL-C, does not mean that you're invincible if your HDL's 3 or whatever, and we don't have the tools yet to measure the function of HDL, which is the most important thing. Mike, would you like to come in on the HDL story? Because the drugs don't work.
Yeah, I mean, again, once again, I'm a fairly simple-minded interventional cardiologist, so I tend to look at relatively straightforward things. And the HDL story is very interesting because although if you look at populations, there is no doubt that, as I showed, there is an inverse correlation between HDL level and the risk of heart disease. So the higher the HDL, the lower the risk of heart disease. Remember ice creams and Blackpool, okay? This does not mean that the one causes the other. And if we go back to the Bradford Hill criteria, one of the crucial parts of that is experiment. And we have had drugs in the past which have lowered the HDL, which have raised HDL. These are the cholesterol estrogen transport protein manipulators. And they didn't work. They didn't lower the body count. And that's what counts in the end. It's the body count for me. So yes, it's clear that that HDL cholesterol is certainly a marker of metabolic health, but it doesn't follow its causative, and it looks at the moment, on the basis of the evidence that we have, that certainly if there is causation there, it's a lot more nuanced than we currently know. And by the way, you can make the same argument for triglycerides as well.
Yeah, Dave, do you want to come in on that? Yeah.
I do have a point of debate here, so this definitely is a distinction. I want the same in kind that I mentioned earlier, cholesterol ester transfer protein being seen, or the inhibitors rather, being seen as the conclusive way by which we could determine HDL-C is not causal in this respect. I'm going to channel Adrian here and say, I think there's nuance. And I do think that we're going to potentially find with the lean mass hyperresponders high HDL-C. Again, it's going to matter what the reason for the higher HDL-C. If you are inhibiting it via this drug compound, I think that the reason for the high HDL-C will turn out to be a different one than what I was describing earlier with the lipoprotein lipase turnover that's at the center of the lipid energy model. Again, I think it's fair to say this is the data we're working with until now. It is experimentation that you're describing, but in a roundabout way, ironically, many of the folks who are lean mass hyperresponders had never had HDL that high. So it actually is a kind of intervention of sorts. At least at this point, it's still observational data, but for which we'll see, will we observe that change? And I guess we'll find out. But that's what I would say.
Do you want to pass to, Peter, yeah.
Why is HDL so indicative in epidemiological studies? Because high HDL is associated with low triglycerides, and it's a sign of metabolic health. So in a large population, it sticks out. But if a patient comes to you in the clinic, he comes there for a reason, and then HDL is completely worthless.
Pass to Mike. Did you have a point, or are you happy?
I was just going to say that, I mean, actually, we don't disagree. Because the thing is, remember again what we said about the numbers that come out of your machine are not measuring one thing. And that number for HDL covers a multitude of sins. And it's not about the number that comes out of the machine. It's about the function of that molecule or range of molecules. And we don't have good tools for measuring that yet.
Yeah, I mean, HDL is like a platform that everything's jumping on and off it, and it's like, I don't think we really understand. Do you have any understanding of HDL, Adrian?
I really wouldn't trust anyone who says who
does.
They do.
Do you think HDL can get constipated? I've heard this being termed around. Has no one heard this? That HDL is so full of cholesterol, well, HDL-C is high and the HDL particle is so full of cholesterol that it's just unable to do its job properly. And most of that has been sucked from LDL, and you know, is that a thing, or is that just someone made that up?
I mean, definitely HDL can pick up cholesterol, and it's actually not only part of the reverse cholesterol transport; it's part of the indirect reverse cholesterol transport because it can hand off its cholesterol cargo to LDL particles as well to take back to the liver.
One opposite example that low HDL can also be beneficial is the ApoA1 Milano, which was a population in northern Italy that lived to a very old age, and they tried to discover what was the reason behind it, and it was actually a very rapid HDL turnover, and they had a very low HDL. So in that case, it can be very confusing to interpret HDL.
So for the people out there, how do we make our HDL as healthy as possible, and how do we make our LDL receptors as healthy as possible? Because surely this is a clearance issue. Is it not a clearance issue?
I already don't like looking at it that way, because your HDL cholesterol is more in, you just mentioned it, I've mentioned it, you're right, it tends to be a sign of metabolic health because it's more of an outcome of, what's going on internally, the machinery of your body, right? So look, triglycerides, I'm going to be, of everything in the lipid panel, I'm going to be zeroing in on triglycerides first. Yeah. If it's high, fasted. I want to know why it's high.
Fasted.
Fasted, correct. And if it's fasted, if you've been fasted for 12 hours and your triglyceride levels are high, I'm going to be very curious as to why that is, because by that point in time, your body should have shuttled them all away.
Yeah.
But triglycerides, as we just discussed, are part of the cargo that's interacting with both ApoB-containing lipoproteins, like VLDL and LDL, and HDL. They're all in service to that process of moving around lipids. So if your triglycerides are high, you already have a problem in trying to look at any of these other markers, including cholesterol on board any of these other particles.
Are you happy to say, Adrian, do you want to come in? Are you happy to say that the reason why fasted triglyceride is high in the blood is because people are, that's a sign that they're breached their personal fat threshold?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And actually, on that same note, and to shamelessly advertise the paper I was trying to show you, but I couldn't.
Yeah.
We just got accepted an analysis, a population analysis, comparing Mexico and the United States on remnant triglyceride-rich lipoproteins.
Yes.
Which it's another big player in this story. And in our analysis, when we look at remnant triglyceride-rich lipoproteins, if you put them head-to-head against LDL, LDL stops mattering. You know, almost all the information for predicting risk is in remnants. And this doesn't mean, again, LDL doesn't matter. I mean, at least for predicting this particular outcome in this particular setting, I guess what I'm trying to say is that in the same paper, what we are showing is, okay, then what predicts remnants, right?
Yeah.
It's insulin resistance. Yeah. And actually, perhaps one point of debate with what Mike presented is that in many different studies, not only ours, when you bring to the table insulin resistance, the relevance, the predictive relevance of LDL is very much hindered, to the point in some of them it does not matter. Another good example would be Dugani in JAMA 2021. They divided LDL by subparticle size as well, and they found a similar story. It was only the small ones who are carrying the weight. Sure. So, again, I'm not saying, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I'm not saying LDL doesn't matter. I'm just saying the context for that LDL ever matters.
Sure. Everyone wants to take away context from this, that it matters. I'm going to wrap up. Does anyone have a beef with anyone else that's unresolved here?
How could you? I mean, they're amazing.
Do you feel like we've covered everything that you want to get off your chest? Have you got a sense, Peter, that you want to say something else? Can I ask you a final question then? Let me just say, Mendelian randomization trials on people with FH, yeah? They've got LDL receptor issue. They've got insanely high lipids. It's completely linked to the early coronary artery disease and death. Is it possible that within that mutation and the effect on the LDL receptor that is affecting multiple other biological systems, such as coagulation, such as the macrophages that Dave talked about? There's the Montreal FH score, isn't there? And that we know that people can get to old age with FH, with no coronary artery disease, and some people go down in their 20s and 30s. So talk to me a bit about that, if you can. What else is the driving force in FH? Is it coagulation? Is it smoking? Is it other lipid abnormalities? What's the smoking gun?
Very basically, you know, the FH simple form is mutation in the LDL receptor causing a very high level of LDL cholesterol. Now, LDL receptors might also be present on macrophages and have some impact on that, but simply looking at the effect, the incredible damage what is happening in the coronary arteries is self-explicable. And what I think is that if you look at these young children, I was in Pakistan last week, and there was a young boy, 11 years old, with extensive xanthomata, with extensive coronary. He had just had an angio. They have no treatment. That kid will live 2 more years, and he's dead. There's nothing they can do about that. So LDL is a driving force, and there's concomitant things that actually contribute to that. I absolutely agree. I try to explain things to patients, so I have to keep it simple and practical and not too abstract. And I also am a car aficionado, so I try to use the car accident as an example. And I give the example that if you want to prevent a car accident, as you want to prevent a cardiovascular event, then one of the most powerful predictors for a car accident is speed. Yeah? And the speed I equivalate with cholesterol. But there's other aspects. You know, there's brakes, there's tires, there's a slippery road, there's all these other aspects. Now, when a car is young, the most important factor is actually the speed. But when a car ages, also if you drive very fast, all the other things start breaking down. And at a certain moment in time, the speed is not even important anymore. You know, the brakes don't work, the tires are crooked, the mirror is broken, and you drive maybe with 30 kilometers and it breaks down because it's old. So I think in atherosclerosis also, the ultimate initial phase is really pushed by cholesterol. After that, other factors play a role and have an important impact. And at the end, you know, cholesterol is maybe not so important anymore in the progression of the disease, but lowering cholesterol is really important in managing the disease, and particularly with statins, because they not only lower cholesterol, but they also have other important effects that reduce that risk.
And lean mass hyperresponders, one of the criteria, if I'm right, is that they had normal cholesterol before they started the dietary intervention. Is that correct? So we can assume that they had normal, to some extent, LDL receptors?
Well, for our study, two things. One, they have to prove to us that they did have an LDL of 160 or lower. Sorry, I can't convert to millimoles right offhand, but 160 or lower in their initial blood work. And then after starting the diet, it had to have increased at least 50% or more to at least 190 or more.
Right.
Now, as it happened, as I mentioned in the match analysis, our average was 272, which looking at NHANES data, I can tell you is in the top 10% of the top 1% of the US population. So it's extremely high. But this may be one place where I can draw a distinction with my good friend Peter on this one, which is it's not that I want, it's important to emphasize I'm not trying to make the case for the opposite. There's a difference between questioning an assertion versus asserting the reverse. What I want to say is I do question the assertion as to whether monogenetic familial hypercholesterolemia, especially homozygous, if the primary means of initiation and progression of plaque, as you're pointing to, if it indeed is driven by ApoB lipoproteins in particular. I know that that's the present lipid hypothesis. I believe that the machinery around the immune response is relevant, perhaps the most relevant, in the case of these children that Brown and Goldstein were looking at who were born with this terrible disease. Yeah. Now, without question, if ApoB-containing lipoproteins are the key driver, we'll absolutely see it with lean mass hyperresponders, as I personally know many who are on the diet for efficacious reasons, not just because they like having high LDL. I know some folks that are at Brown and Goldstein levels. And they're actively getting scans. Many of them are not even in the study, but who we may be making case reports for. You would expect that they would see the same symptoms and the same, likewise, levels of atherosclerosis.
So we should be tracking these people, basically, to check. But I think time-wise, we're struggling, aren't we?
We're okay, but I think Adrian is desperate.
Okay,
to say
Adrian,
something.
last point, and then we're
Feels
going
like
to go to the audience, because I know you guys probably want to ask some questions of these experts.
The point that was burning me is just because I heard the word Mendelian, and that's triggered me.
Not a fan of...
That's one of the largest sources of noise I've seen around this debate. And don't get me wrong, Mendelian randomization, certain subtypes of Mendelian randomization methods are reliable.
Yeah.
But they are far from being a lifelong randomized controlled trial, or they are nowhere close an actual experiment. This is not my opinion. This is George David Smith's opinion, who invented the stuff.
Right.
And if you're going to look for really educated opinion about Mendelian randomization, he has a super funny lecture named No Nulls, Numbskulls, and Noodles for Mendelian randomization.
Right.
Criticizing how much bullshit there is.
Really? God, Eddie Abu's channeling.
Sorry. But I mean, I'm quoting the guy, I swear you.
Okay.
But yeah, please don't think Mendelian randomization are experiments.
Can you possibly share that later on Twitter or something so we can get a handle on that? Because I don't want people to think that you just don't like monks who like plants.
No, not at all, not at all. And let me be clear. I mean, George David Smith uses cholesterol examples for support Mendelian randomization.
Okay.
I mean, and he gives those arguments. The key point here is that Mendelian randomization, the underlying assumption in the causal structure of Mendelian randomization is what he calls the gene-environment equivalence. In other words, you are assuming that the gene that's being randomized has an equivalence with the environment you're trying to replicate, which is basically saying context doesn't matter. And I have a strong opinion against saying context.
Well, we're going to come away from this saying context does matter. Okay, let's go to the audience, please, for questions. Say your name and be quick.
Hi, my name's Gary. This is, well, for everybody, but aimed particularly at Dr. Fisher. You talked about high LDL and inflammation being the main problem, and then you reduce LDL. That will save the life of that individual if they're in front of yourself. My question then is, what do you do then? Because if the inflammation stays, you just kick the can down the road a little bit. There are a whole host of chronic metabolic diseases caused by systemic inflammation, which myself as a nutrition coach, I can reduce that and remove causation, as can a lot of people in this room and the organizations we're in. So how do we get referrals from doctors into people who can reduce that inflammation? And that won't include NHS dietitians and nutritionists, because they're trained on the Eat Well guide, and that won't do it.
Mike?
Well, I would make the point, just to start off with, that when it comes to death, kicking the can down the road is quite a useful thing to do and something that a lot of my patients are quite interested in. But that doesn't mean that I don't absolutely take your point. What we've all been trying to say is that there is a variety of factors going on here. And you can lower LDL cholesterol because clearly you can't get rid of it. The other factors remain important, and inflammation is one of those. Now, we don't, as yet, have particularly well-validated ways of reducing inflammation. But what we do know is that metabolic syndrome is a pro-inflammatory environment. So I will also advise people on exercise, which I'm an incredibly boring crap record about the benefits of exercise, about avoiding insulin resistance with reducing carbohydrate, or in some cases radically reducing it. So I do attempt to pay some heed to the other elements of this process, inflammation in particular. But equally well, I also have to try and major on those things for which I have the most evidence as things stand, which as it stands is the LDL hypothesis. But that doesn't mean for an instant that, that I don't try and take some notice of the other particularly pro-inflammatory things. In terms of your question of how do we get doctors to take notice of something other than LDL, well, they need educating, don't they? And I have to say, you know, I am a fan of the medical model. Obviously, I've spent my life doing it. But there are many other things which clearly are important, as judged by the medical model, about which many of my colleagues appear to know nothing at all. And so we clearly have a job of work to do in terms of educating some of my colleagues.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Who's next?
Okay, me. Yeah, it's okay. Question for you. You've outlined 3 different models here. One, clearly something to do with genetics, fair enough. One, people with metabolic syndrome. One, people that are healthy. Currently, you've said LDL is absolutely essential for vitamin D, for various other things. We have 90-odd% of the population has got insulin resistance syndrome. Why are we not seeing that the American Heart Association and every other association connected to heart health is not putting the emphasis on trying to resolve why our kids are getting high LDL at the age of 3, why we are ending up with LDL problems in our 20 and 30-year-olds, why we are seeing a gradual increase in heart disease in youngsters.
Yeah.
I don't understand why it is a battle to get the cardiology community behind trying to do what we're all trying to do, which is understand the value of food. Yeah. So why is it still not here?
But shall I take that one? I mean, yeah, I've been president of a national association. We work with the BHF. We work with loads of different stakeholders to try and get this on the radar. The problem is that nobody likes change. that is genuinely an issue. We're so wedded and so blinkered in medicine to some degree, and at that level, that it's going to take policy change. It's going to take people, like you said, with the food, the grassroots revolution to explain that the majority of lipid abnormalities are coming from insulin resistance and lipoprotein insulin resistance. And the sooner we get people realizing that they're diabetic at 20 and that they're over fat, the better. And that's coming from people like Eddie Abu who've got social media reach. The lipid community is a very, very small community. So I think that's because the medical profession are dealing with sick care and have always dealt with sick care. Our job was to bang stents into people when they came in with a heart attack. Now, you can't take that away because you still need someone to open your coronary artery. You can't take away someone who puts a pacemaker in because your heart's too slow. And people develop into cults in medicine. So I'm someone who puts stents in. I'm someone who does a pacemaker. No one did prevention until a few of us broke away and said, look, we're going to focus on this. It's in its early days because, you know, I've had a colleague say to me, why do I want to prevent heart disease? That's my business. Yeah. No, I'm telling you the truth. So we need people to say we need prevention. We need hospital trusts to release jobs in prevention. There are no jobs in prevention. There's no money in prevention. No, well, anyway, another question?
Can I give a tough love answer?
Yeah.
Real quick. We have to take some ownership of this ourselves, us non-doctors, as patients. We have to put more of our words to the doctors to say that's what's important to us and to our family. We have to do that because I've been to these conferences myself, and with respect, Scott, there are some things that do change pretty quickly. It depends on whether or not it's a new medication that's come out, right?
Yeah, you're right.
I think your point's well taken, and I think there's many of very well-meaning, good-hearted doctors who say back to me, look, I can either prescribe this thing in the time that I have available to see my patient, which is very limited, or I can take 30 minutes to try to tell them their lifestyle isn't working.
Yeah.
I just don't have that kind of time. But the more that, in the US, one thing that's been growing is concierge doctors.
Yeah.
And those are driven by us. making a point to do that. I don't know if that happens here in the UK.
Not
but-
much, and I just want to say something, just you've reminded me. Some patients don't want to change, and you're all here because you're willing to change your mind, you're
Yeah.
willing to be open. But me and Mike talk to patients that were blue in the face about doing stuff. They come back and they're heavier, their lipids are worse. So do we let those people just carry on getting worse, or do we implicate a treatment because they don't have the health literacy or the ability to make those changes? There's a treatment gap there, and if we don't treat those people, we're failing them. So you have to take that into account. Not everyone's like you, who's willing to take on all this research and change your diet. The most important thing to people in Liverpool, where is the chip shop and who's won the football? And we know that. We know that. We've done the studies. Any more questions?
No.
All right,
we
so we
haven't
can
got
all go?
time. Thank you also about you.
So, yeah,
I'll leave you with a quick joke. How do you spot the engineer among the doctors? They're the ones that came without a jacket, so now you know.
We're going to wrap it up. I just want to say thanks to everyone for staying to the end. Thanks for being involved in what was pretty much a nerd fest, if I'm honest. But hopefully you got something out of it. Context matters. Not everyone needs a statin. You just need to have a think about it. Cholesterol can go up for other reasons. There are no good and bad cholesterol. There are lipoproteins that carry the cholesterol. Take that away with you if you can. So I'd like to thank Peter for representing lipidology, Mike Fisher for clinical cardiology, Dave and Adrian. I thought it was very good. Thank you. Enjoy your trip home. Stay safe.